A man is on the open deck of a destroyer. The sea is very rough. The ship is rolling hard, waves hitting the side, water everywhere. The man runs across the deck to get inside the destroyer before the next wave comes. He makes it in, the door closes, and now he is inside. But this is where he will live for months. He will eat here, sleep here, and work here, while the ship never stops moving. This video answers one question. How do 300 sailors eat, work, and sleep inside a destroyer in rough seas for months at a time? If by the end of this video you respect what these sailors do, type proud in the comments. The surface enemy looks obvious. It is the ocean, the swells, the weather that turns a 500-foot warship into a roller coaster with no off switch. But the ocean is not what breaks a destroyer crew. The real enemy is math. It is the arithmetic of a 24-hour day divided by a watch rotation that was never built around how the human brain actually works. Most people look at a warship underway and see steel, radar, missiles, raw power projected across an ocean. What they miss is that inside that hull, the deadliest variable is not the weapon system, it is the clock. In 2017, investigators found that watchstanders aboard USS Fitzgerald were so fatigued at the moment of a fatal collision with a commercial container ship that their situation awareness had collapsed. 7 sailors died. Weeks later, 10 more died aboard USS John S. McCain in a separate collision, and fatigue was cited again. That is not a training failure. That is an institution discovering at the cost of 17 lives that the schedule itself had become the danger. What happens to a human body and a human mind after months of a watch rotation that never lines up with daylight, that never gives more than a few broken hours of sleep at a stretch? To understand how deep this goes, picture something you already know, a cross-country road trip where you never get to stop driving, never get a full night in a bed, and never get to leave the vehicle for more than a few minutes at a time, for 6 to 9 months straight. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer runs 505 feet long, a little longer than a football field and a half. It carries a crew of roughly 300 to 380 sailors, depending on the variant and mission configuration. Each of those sailors gets somewhere around 50 square feet of personal space once you count their rack, a sliver of common area, and shared access to the head. That is the equivalent of living inside a walk-in closet, sharing it with hundreds of strangers for the length of an entire school year. The ship can operate independently for roughly a month, sometimes stretching toward 45 days depending on its operational tempo, hauling enough fuel, food, and ammunition to fight a war on its own. Food stores typically cover around 30 days. Fuel endurance depends heavily on speed. At 20 knots, the ship's range is roughly 4,400 nautical miles, meaning continuous high-speed steaming drains the tanks in about 9 days, while a lower-intensity operational profile stretches that window considerably. That is the equivalent of a small town deciding to survive for a month and a half with 0 deliveries, 0 mail, and 0 way to leave. Deployments themselves routinely stretch 6 to 9 months. That is the equivalent of missing every holiday, every birthday, and every ordinary Tuesday dinner with your family for the better part of a year, while pitching through swells that never fully stop, and that is before the weather turns hostile enough to make simply walking down a passageway a genuine risk to life and limb. Feeding 300 sailors on a moving object is not a restaurant problem. It is an engineering problem, wearing an apron. A handful of culinary specialists, often as few as 6 on a watch, are responsible for producing roughly 1,200 meals a day, every day, for months, inside a galley so cramped that every movement has to be planned around the next swing of the ship. The ship can be making 31 knots and rolling through 10, 15, 20 degrees of heel at the same time. These sailors are handling boiling grease, spinning mixers, and knives. 2 exact numbers matter here. The galley typically runs a 21-day menu rotation, meaning the same roughly 3 weeks of meals repeat on a loop for the entire deployment. And the mess deck itself often seats only around 80 people at a time, forcing staggered meal shifts around the clock. Think of it like running a diner that never closes, on a floor that never stops tilting, for a customer base that never goes home. Except the cooks cannot simply close early when they are exhausted, because the next watch section is already lining up hungry. A civilian short-order cook clocks out after a double shift. The Navy culinary specialist finishes a 16-hour day and goes straight into rack time because in 6 hours the mess line opens again. That is a workload with essentially no equivalent in civilian food service. The rating who burns his forearm on a fry basket during a hard roll does not get a shift change or hazard pay for it. He gets a bandage from sickbay and the next watch to cook. Sleep aboard a destroyer is where the ship's design stops being impressive and starts being unsettling. Enlisted sailors sleep in berthing compartments where racks stack 3 high, and each individual rack measures roughly 6 feet long and 2 to 2.5 feet wide, with as little as 18 to 24 inches of vertical clearance between your body and the sailor sleeping above you. There is no sitting up. You slide in horizontally in a space that more closely resembles a filing cabinet drawer or a coffin than anything resembling a bedroom. Hot racking, where 2 sailors on opposite watch rotations share a single rack, is standard practice aboard submarines where space is at an absolute premium. On surface ships like destroyers, each sailor normally has his own rack, but when a ship is overmanned, carrying extra detachments or transient personnel, hot racking can be forced on the crew. When one sailor's watch ends, he wakes the other, who climbs into sheets that are quite literally still warm from the last body that occupied them. Think of it like a rental car that never gets returned to the lot, just handed directly from one driver to the next, engines still running, except this rental car is the only place on Earth you get to rest. The old 2-section watch bill, 6 hours on and 6 hours off, sounds survivable on paper. In practice, the Government Accountability Office found that only 14% of officers received 7 hours or more of sleep during their most recent deployment. That means 86% did not. The surface force-wide average of actual sleep obtained sits at just 5.25 hours, well below the 7.5 hours the Navy's own standard requires. Studies of naval personnel consistently show that this level of chronic sleep restriction produces cognitive impairment equivalent to legal intoxication. The Navy's newer 3-section watch bill, rotating sailors through 8-hour blocks, was designed to address this, but even under the improved system, sailors still routinely fall short of the sleep their bodies need. The chief who signs off on a watch bill that shaves an hour of sleep from 30 sailors does not get blamed publicly if nothing goes wrong. He just quietly owns it if something eventually does. Working aboard a destroyer means the ship runs on a rhythm that has nothing to do with sunrise or sunset. At any given moment, roughly 1/3 of the crew stands watch. 1/3 handles maintenance, training, and drills, and 1/3 is theoretically resting. That word theoretically is doing enormous work. General quarters drills, equipment casualties, and unscheduled maintenance routinely eat into that resting third's hours, and across a full deployment, sailors average just 5 to 6 hours of sleep per 24-hour period. On demanding days, the combined load of standing watch, running drills, performing maintenance, training, and required cleaning pushes a sailor's actual working day towards 16 to 18 hours before whatever scraps of time remain for sleep. Compare that to an ordinary civilian shift worker on a brutal rotating schedule, someone working nights at a hospital or a refinery. That worker still gets a fixed number of days off in a row to reset his internal clock. A destroyer sailor gets no such reset for 6 to 9 months. That is a compounding recovery deficit that no amount of individual toughness can fully offset, stacked day after day for the entire deployment. Have you ever pulled an all-nighter for work or school and felt your judgment slip by hour 20 without even noticing it happening? Now imagine that state being your baseline for months, while also being responsible for a warship carrying enough firepower to shape the outcome of a regional conflict. That is the honest version of what standing watch means aboard a destroyer in rough weather. Before we go further, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. Over 98% of you watch without subscribing. It costs you nothing but makes a huge difference. Now back to what actually happens when the weather turns against a 500-foot ship carrying 300 exhausted human beings. Rough seas do not just make a destroyer uncomfortable, they make it a fundamentally different, more dangerous machine to live inside. A destroyer's relatively narrow beam compared to something like an aircraft carrier means it rolls far more violently in the same sea state. A design trade-off that buys speed and agility at the direct cost of stability. Sailors have reported and logged rolls of 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and beyond in severe storms. Angles at which loose gear becomes a projectile and simply crossing a passageway means bracing against bulkheads with both hands. In rough sea conditions, a significant majority of sailors aboard can experience some degree of seasickness compared to well under 5% in calm water. The exact percentage varies by sea state, individual susceptibility, and how many days into the deployment the crew is, but the operational impact is undeniable. Think of it like riding in the back seat of a car on a winding mountain road, except the road never ends, the car never stops swaying, and you still have to cook dinner, fix the engine, and stand guard duty while it happens. For most of naval history, seasickness was simply treated as an unavoidable cost of doing business at sea. You dealt with it or you suffered through it, and no one wrote it down. The U.S. Navy now trains sailors in specific mitigation techniques, positioning near the ship's center of motion, staying topside and visually anchored to the horizon when safe and deliberate slow movement instead of stiff resistance to the roll. That is a meaningful difference in operational readiness during exactly the conditions when readiness matters most. The corpsman who spends a rough night rehydrating seasick sailors one at a time in sickbay does not appear in any after-action report. He just does it again the next storm. And then there is the number that changes everything. The comprehensive review the Navy conducted after the Fitzgerald and McCain collisions found that command leadership on the Fitzgerald allowed a schedule of demanding operations to run right up against a watch rotation, leaving the overnight watch section fatigued and without adequate rest. On the exact night the ship failed to see a container ship bearing down on it in a routine shipping lane. Investigators determined the bridge and combat information center watchstanders were likely acutely fatigued, degrading their situational awareness at the precise moment it mattered most. 7 sailors drowned in flooded berthing compartments. Weeks later, 10 more died aboard the McCain under a strikingly similar pattern of fatigue and inadequate rest management. These were not combat losses. These were sailors killed by a system that had normalized exhaustion as simply the price of doing business at sea. The Navy's response was not a minor policy memo. It became a full doctrinal overhaul called the Comprehensive Crew Endurance Management Policy, which now requires sailors receive a minimum of 7.5 hours of sleep and caps working days at 12 hours where operationally possible. Watch rotations were redesigned to align with the body's natural circadian rhythm instead of arbitrarily splitting the clock in half. That is a direct-to-one trade. The old 2-section, 6-on, 6-off rotation that produced performance equivalent to legal drunkenness against a new circadian-aligned system built from actual sleep science. 17 names bought that policy change. The surface warfare officer who now builds a watch bill with circadian rhythm charts instead of simple arithmetic does not get thanked publicly for it. He just quietly prevents the next Fitzgerald from happening. Working out aboard a destroyer sounds almost absurd once you understand the constraints. Shipboard gyms are typically a single modest space resembling a compact locker room, stocked with a handful of dumbbells, some cable machines, maybe 2 treadmills and 2 stationary bikes bolted to the deck so they do not become hazards in rough seas. Sailors supplement this with bodyweight circuits, push-ups, planks, resistance bands that pack down small enough to store in a locker the size of a filing cabinet drawer, because that is genuinely the amount of personal storage most enlisted sailors are allotted. On a ship rolling 20 degrees, even a simple set of squats becomes a balance exercise nobody signed up for. Do you think you could hold a plank, throw punches at a heavy bag, or run on a treadmill while the floor beneath you is actively tilting 15 degrees in either direction? Let us know in the comments. The Navy treats physical fitness aboard these ships not as an amenity but as a readiness requirement, because a body that cannot move efficiently during a hard roll is a body at risk during any real emergency, whether that is a fire, a flooding casualty, or general quarters in the middle of the night. The mental toll compounds everything already described. Chaplains were historically assigned only to large deck ships like aircraft carriers and amphibious assault vessels. Destroyers relied on lay leaders and visiting chaplains from the squadron or strike group level. That has changed. The Navy is now growing its chaplain force by roughly 90 positions, specifically to embed chaplains aboard deploying destroyers, a direct institutional acknowledgement that months of cramped quarters, broken sleep, seasickness, and isolation from family produce a psychological cost the Navy can no longer afford to ignore. A destroyer costs roughly $2 billion to build and field. The junior enlisted sailor standing an overnight watch inside that $2 billion system, monitoring radar returns that could mean the difference between a routine night and a collision, often earns a base pay in the range of $22,000 to $26,000 a year before housing and food allowances are added. Think of it like hiring the person responsible for protecting a small fortune and paying them close to minimum wage while asking them to do it exhausted, seasick, and thousands of miles from anyone who loves them. That gap between the value of the asset and the value placed on the person operating it is one of the quietest, least discussed costs in the entire surface fleet. What the official reports do not tell you, buried beneath acronyms like watch bills and crew endurance policies, is that the sailors who died aboard the Fitzgerald and the McCain were doing exactly what they were trained and scheduled to do. They were not reckless. They were exhausted by a system that had not yet learned to respect its own people's biology. And it took their deaths to force that lesson into doctrine. Every sailor standing watch tonight on a destroyer somewhere in the Pacific or the Atlantic is operating inside the policy their deaths rewrote, sleeping in a rack barely wider than a coffin, eating the same 21-day rotation of meals for the 6th time this deployment, and doing it anyway, because the mission does not pause for exhaustion or grief. These are the sailors standing watch through storms most of us will never see sleeping in spaces. Most of us would refuse to store luggage in so that the rest of us can sleep soundly under the shield they quietly provide. If this video changed the way you see a Navy uniform, subscribe now. The story you just heard is still being written right now on a destroyer somewhere over the horizon by someone who will never ask you to know their name.